Greetings, I'm Herbert Erpert, and what better way to end the very real month of Jagdpanzer 38T July than by painting the 48th scale Hetzer from Tamiya. I'm sure all of you watched the build video the other day, so you'll know that I forgot to film the spinny video for the end of that because I began painting it right away. And by right away, I mean slowly, over however many months it was. Cool story, bro! I know, right? Anyway, priming is always the first step. I prime with SMS Black Surfacer because it's quite good. Stinky, but good. I airbrush a base coat with Vallejo Model Air Middlestone. An airbrush isn't absolutely necessary, of course, but it is a great tool for getting a nice, smooth and consistent coat. Obviously over black this does take a couple of coats. It is a nice colour, though maybe a little darker than I really wanted, but that's okay. I follow it with a fairly heavy highlight from above. I'm using a mix of roughly 2 parts of the Model Air Middlestone with 1 part model colour Ivory. As always, I don't make a precise mix, so a rough mix is all you get. While this is fairly heavy, so it is more or less the main colour now, it's not a completely opaque coat. Some of the original colour is still showing beneath, mostly on the lower areas. I did have a very minor oopsie boingo with the airbrush, so you might see a couple of specks of that colour. I know, I should be jailed for these crimes. A good way to hide that was with the first camo pattern colour, which I'm doing in small, rounded splotches. Nothing jagged or pointy here. I'm using By Mig Resedagrün? However you want to say that, there's no English equivalent on the bottle. This is from the Atom 1944-45 German Standard Colours box set. Seems like quite a nice paint, and I do like the lids. Also, it comes with an agitator in the bottle, and I like that. Anyway, in my internet travels, I came across a Hetzer painted in a pattern a little bit like this. I've also seen similar in painting guides with kits, so I figured, why not? I've no idea what this camo pattern is actually called, and I am just doing it from my head, so if you're here expecting 100% historically accurate painting, for some reason, you're probably in the wrong place. Stick around anyway though. Why? I don't know, just do it. In hindsight, I probably could have made these green splotches a bit bigger, but I am pretty happy with them. Next, I paint around all the green splotches with Camo Schokobraun, which is from the same box set as the green. This is not the most difficult thing, though I did have to choose a day when my hands were a little bit less shaky, and I also kind of wished I'd done larger splotches, but certainly not enough to start over. I guess the main negative about doing this is that it is a little bit time consuming. You can tell I did this in 2 sessions, because in between, I changed my camera settings for whatever reason, and didn't change them back. I'm a professional! Anyway, I think the result is interesting. Decals go on next, so they don't miss out on any of the weathering to come. I apply clear gloss, and that's over the entire side panel, so if and when it changes the colour underneath it, even if it is subtle, it's along a panel edge, so it should be less noticeable. The actual application of the decals is quite simple. They're just crosses from the kit's decal sheet, and I'm using Mark Fit Strong. If you want, you could add another layer of gloss after this, or maybe even matte varnish. I chose not to because I didn't really feel a need for it. Obviously though, you want to leave a bit of time between applying the decals and the next step, which is an all-over wash of Army Painter Military Shader, mixed roughly 1 part shader to 3 parts water. This wash is fairly thin. I didn't want it to be overpowering. What this does is darken everything down just a touch, and impart a slightly dirty look, especially in any gaps and recesses. As with pretty much any wash, I try not to let this pool up too much on any flat surfaces. That's how you get weird tide marks. I think the result I got here is quite effective. Once that's good and dry, it's time for the same good old chipping method I usually use, which is By Mig chipping colour, though you can obviously use any colour you like for chipping, even hot pink if you want. Whatever colour is applied with an artist's sponge in an up and down motion only. Avoid dragging the sponge across the model, up and down only. I do like artist's sponge, it's cheap and easy enough to find, but you can also use the foam you might find in a model package. Any kind of spongy foam should work. I'm trying not to go overboard with this chipping, and I think I almost kind of succeeded here. It's not totally overboard, but it is a tiny bit more than I really wanted. I do find it difficult to get the right amount, but I'm getting better, maybe, I hope. If you've seen the way I paint before, you won't be surprised that the next step is scratches. These are meant to complement the chips, and I use the same colour on a very fine brush. I'm simply painting very thin lines in areas that I think it makes sense that there'd be a good long scratch. I'm also trying not to go overboard with this. The smaller in scale a model gets, the less likely you would see this kind of thing. I do all of this now, before any of the detaily bits or tracks are painted, because those don't need this chipping. Painting the rubber on the wheels is the next step, and I'm using Ammo rubber and tyres for this. Totally wild that a paint with that name would work so well for rubber tyres. On this Hetzer, it's really easy to do this. The wheel rim is raised enough that it kind of acts like a guide. As long as you are gentle, the brush probably won't go up on top of the rim, if that makes sense. It was a little bit tricky to get in under the idler and drive sprocket, but not impossible. Don't forget the return roller, that should probably be nice and rubbery too. This will almost certainly require some touch-ups later, but that is usually the case with wheels and tracks. I painted the binoculars with Vallejo Model Color Reflective Green. I've seen pictures of these in a dark green colour, so I figured this would make a nice base coat. I followed that by painting this block, which I assume is for jacking. I used Model Color Camouflage Pale Brown here. Seemed like a woody enough base colour, and totally not just the first close enough brown that I grabbed. I would assume this entire thing would just be painted with the hull colour sometimes, but this looks more visually interesting. At this point, I considered painting the commander's hatch with an interior colour, but then I figured maybe that doesn't make a lot of sense. A cream or white colour wouldn't help with the camo very much, and I would imagine because of the binoculars this would be open quite a bit, so I left it as it is. It's probably going to be a little bit hard to see in the end, but I figured it might look good if I painted the looky bits of the binoculars with model colour black. Why not? I also painted the front of the gun side. I figured this would be the same colour as the hull, except at the front, where there's a hole with a lens and such. Now it's time to paint the various tools. Like the rooftop MG, that's a tool, kinda. The colour I'm using here is Scale 75 Black Metal, which is a kind of dark and metal-y looking paint. I quite like it, though it's not always quite as dark as I would like. It should look better with a dark wash, which I'll do later. Now we're getting to the actual tools. This bar is nicely raised off the hull, so it's easy to paint the entire thing neatly without needing to do touch-ups. That's nice. Same for the jack, more or less. You do have to use just a little bit more caution and neatness with it so you don't paint over the brackets that hold it on the hull. Same goes for the towing cable, and you will probably need to be a little bit more careful next to the hull here. There's not a huge amount of space to work in, so it's possible to bump into things and get paint where you don't want it quite easily. Having said that, it sounds way more dramatic than it actually is. It's not that hard. While I had this colour out, I added a tiny spot to represent glass on the main gun side. It doesn't really look like glass up close, but hopefully this will cause it to grab some attention in the right light like a real glass lens might. You might have noticed that I forgot one little bit of the brown camo outline. The worst crime imaginable. Straight to jail. Double jail. I've already done one crime. At some point, I noticed, and then fixed it, just in time for the tracks. I quite liked the way the Ammo by Mig shadow rust looked on the Sentinel I painted a while ago, which I'm sure everybody watched, so why not use it again here? It is a nice colour. The trick is to paint the tracks and avoid the rest of the model, which is a bit easier in some areas than others. Using appropriately sized brushes is an obvious way to deal with that. I also decided to paint the sides of the suspension parts that you can see between the wheels with this colour. I figured that might add some interest. It's probably not a bad idea to paint the spare track links with this colour too. I figured it made sense to paint the exhaust with this colour too. I mean, it's a rusty colour, so it should make a good base for the lighter rust colours that I plan to add there. Then it's time for a bit of a highlight using Vallejo Model Air Rust. Much like with the Sentinel, I'm simply applying this to the raised areas of the tracks, like the long tread parts that go across the links here. Also the outer edges of the links, and the upper areas of the guide horns. It's not quite a dry brush, the paint is wet, especially being a Model Air colour, and it's a bit more focused than a dry brush too, but it's kind of a similar thing. It's a highlight. I didn't want to go too heavily with it, nor do I want it to be too consistent and have it look like I've just painted a straight line of rust across the guide horns. The thinness of Model Air paint works quite well with this. This is applied to the spare track links too, because why not? those are rusty as well. I then stipple the Model Air rust onto the exhaust to try and create a more patchy rusty look that you might see on that kind of thing. This is a Citadel dry brush, which I pretty much never use for dry brushing, but it does work very well for stippling. I did this again, this time with Model Air Light Rust. I tried to do roughly the same amount of this as the previous colour. I also did a very light, almost dry brushing with this on some of the track edges, because why not? Only on the in-use tracks though, not the spares. While I had the ammo rubber and tyres out to do touch-ups on the road wheels, I painted a couple of things I'd forgotten, one of them being the antenna base, because this seemed like a good colour for that sort of thing, and what I think is a convoy light on the rear. I'm not sure if that's the right colour for it, but it does look a bit more interesting than when it was the same colour as the hull. I figured now was the right time for testing out some of the ammo shaders I recently acquired. They're a bit like the Army Painter quick shades I often use. Here I'm applying the light rust shader undiluted to the exhaust. It's just kinda slopped on there. It's not really darker than most of the rust colour here, so I wouldn't say it made a huge difference, but it is certainly a positive result, in my opinion. I didn't think it would be quite as good on the tracks, so for those, I apply the Ammo Grime shader, which is mixed roughly 1 part shader to 1.5-ish parts water. And again, I just kinda slopped it on all over the tracks, though I am being careful not to get too much of it on the hull. Not that it's a real problem if you do get it on the hull. If you spread it out and blend it in, you'll barely see it, and it should just look like a slightly dirty patch. It's free weathering. What matters is the majority of it goes on the tracks. Also the road wheels, but I'm being a bit more careful here. I want it mostly on the rubber parts, and very, very lightly on the inside of the rim. It hasn't made huge changes to the base colours, but it is a nice subtle effect. I still had a little bit left, and I thought it might add some interest if I put some on the towing cable, only the cable part and not the ends. This will almost certainly be overpowered by the next wash, but it might do a little something. At the very least, it's not going to hurt anything. Probably. Why not try another ammo shader? This time, Satin Black, though it is called Ash Black on the packaging. I applied this undiluted to all the things I painted with the black metal. This is pretty much exactly as I would have done with Army Painter Dark Tone. This is pretty effective, though I did have to apply multiple layers in order to get the darkness I wanted in some areas. I also applied some to the exhaust in order to create a sort of burned and sooty look in a couple of spots. I did a couple of layers of that too. Continuing with the undiluted Satin Black shader, I darkened down the vision devices, even though one of them is missing the brush guard. The driver's vision holes also get some darkening. My advanced technique for removing unwanted bits around the opening is wiping it with a finger. That must have taken years to perfect. Then I apply more of the Grime shader, also undiluted, to the binoculars. It's not all that noticeable, but that's fine. It's a lot more noticeable on the jacking block. Like with the base coat, I'm trying to avoid the frame bits, but this will naturally gather in the corners there, which makes for a nice effect. I then came back and did a dry brushing with the original reflective green on the binoculars, and some very gentle lines of the original colour on the jacking block. I then put a tiny bit of undiluted Army Painter blue tone over the metallic colour on the gun side. I just thought that would look a bit more interesting, and maybe a bit more glassy. Then, after a lot of umming and ahhing, as I pondered if there was more to add or anything to change, I applied some matte varnish, which I didn't film, but this is what it looked like afterwards. Some final touches have to be done after the matte varnish, otherwise they don't work, like applying graphite, using a pencil, a 2B pencil in this case, which I'm rubbing onto the tracks where they'd be worn to a shine, as you can probably see. I also use this to highlight the ends of the towing cable. It's far more subtle than a metallic paint would be, and it's not overly shiny. When it catches the light just right, it's a really great effect. I also apply some to the teeth of the drive sprocket, though they are tiny, so it is kind of hard to see. I also put some of this on the outer rim of the idler wheel, where it isn't really seen, but it does add a little something, if you do see it. And finally, I put a dot of gloss varnish over the gun side, just to give it that little bit of shine that was taken away by the matte varnish. I think it's looking pretty good. So, for now, the Tamiya 48th scale Hetzer is completed. Paint and all. I'm pretty happy with the result. I would have sat on it a little bit longer pondering if there was anything to add or change, but I did want the video done within the very real and not at all made up month of Jagdpanzer 38T July. Of course, just because you've declared a model done doesn't mean you can't go back and make changes or add things later. I probably won't, but it is a thing that can be done. Anyway, I'm quite pleased with this result. I've not done this camo pattern before, but I like it and I think it's interesting. I'm sure it's not all that historically accurate, and somebody has probably soiled their pants about it and will soon be furiously tapping away at their keyboard. But as I said, it's something I saw, and then, well, replicated probably isn't the correct word, reproduced is probably more accurate, and I reproduced it off the top of my head. That's part of the joy of modelling, at least for me. Doing things that are interesting and new, or new to yourself anyway, and making something that pleases you. Be that an exact, historically accurate paint scheme, something imagined, or something in between. I guess I don't really have much else to say about this. I think the result is nice, I had fun doing it, and I tried some different paints that I hadn't used before. The ammo shaders are rather nice. I'm not that analytical or as opinionated as some on things like paint, but they work nicely and look good. They're really not all that different from the Army Painter quick shades I use. They do come in a lot of different colours and sets though, which is cool. Some might complain about the 10ml bottles, but I've got 18ml bottles that I've had for years and never used up, so I don't really see that as a problem. Anyway, I'm waffling and going off topic. I hope everybody had a fantastic Jagdpanzer 38T July and celebrated appropriately. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comments section below. Subscribe if you want to see more of this kind of thing, share the video with anybody you think might find it helpful, and if you really like what I do and you'd like to see videos a bit early, consider supporting on Patreon or Ko-fi if you're able. Links are in the description. Take care of yourselves, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.